the backbone of everything, like our economy, the country, the whole deal. And I was so glad that somebody recognized these folks for who they are.
Welcome to the Oakley Podcast, Trucking, Business, and Family. This show is brought to you by Oakley Trucking, headquartered in North Little Rock, Arkansas. The purpose of this podcast is to communicate with Oakley owner-operators and their families by giving them up-to-date information concerning Oakley Trucking and the trucking industry, from business advice to safety updates to success stories. Also to give an insight to outside truck drivers that might be interested in joining the Oakley family. Hi, I'm Jeremy Kellett, Director of Recruiting here at Oakley Trucking, and I'm your host for this podcast. This is episode 29. Oh man, on today's podcast, we got a great one lined up for you today. I've got a special guest lined up to talk to us in just a minute. His name is Al Robertson from Duck Dynasty. I know y'all remember that. Al is going to visit with us a little bit about a few things. One, we're going to talk about what's been happening since Duck Dynasty's over. And we're going to talk about his new Unashamed podcast that's out. I don't know if you guys have listened to this, but it is fantastic. I listen to it. My son listens to it. And it has got some great biblical information in it, and just good information that gives you a good idea of what's going on in the world today. And they dumb it down for me. I can tell you that. It's a simple podcast and very fun to listen to. So be sure and listen to that. But we're going to talk about that. We're also going to touch on Al's perspective on keeping a family together while on the road. Al and his wife are big in the ministry in marriages and families, and we're going to get his input and take on great ways to do that and what the Bible says about that and keeping a marriage and a family together while you're on the road. And also just some encouraging words from Al on conditions in today's world, what's happening today. And, you know, with Al, there's no telling which direction we'll go. Me and him get to talking, and we may not even cover any of these things we just talked about, but he is great to listen to. I enjoy him a whole lot. And as soon as we get finished here with Vickie Chastain's Need to Know segment, we're going to dive off in with Al Robertson of Duck Dynasty.
Every driver will experience difficult driving conditions from weather, road conditions, and other drivers during their time behind the wheel. And safe situations, that's this week's Need to Know segment. You're responsible for keeping yourself, others, and your cargo safe. Don't let anyone push you to do things that aren't safe, including driving too fast, going over your hours, or anything else that puts your safety and the safety of others at risk. Ice, snow, rain, and fog create unsafe driving situations that require you to be extra cautious and watch your speed while driving. It's an important skill that truck drivers learn how to drive safely in poor conditions. I'm Vickie Chastain, and that's this week's Need to Know segment.
Okay, let's dive into today's episode with Mr. Al Robertson. I got him on the line right now. Hey, Al, how's it going?
Doing good, Jeremy. How about you?
Man, doing pretty good, I guess. Up here in North Little Rock and doing good. You guys surviving, repairing after the hurricane down there?
I tell you what, I mean, I've been storm jumping here for about a month. You know, my wife and I bought a condo down at Gulf Shores, and so when the one came through Louisiana, we escaped to the Gulf Coast to escape a hurricane, which you wouldn't normally do. Thing ripped through here, and then I came back home, and wouldn't you know it, the next one came through and ripped through where my condo is. So
oh man,
I'm starting to feel like I got a big bullseye on my properties.
Yeah, I was talking to my Uncle Mike about it, and he said it was some really bad damage there in West Monroe with all the trees down. He said it was just terrible.
Yeah. In fact, we were walking, my wife and I were walking through our neighborhood yesterday, and we hadn't walked in a while, and I couldn't believe how many trees were just down just in our neighborhood alone, and probably had about maybe 4 or 5 houses that had tarps on them, and where trees had come down through the ceiling. It was bad. It was, most people didn't kind of realize it this far north, but it was still a Cat 2 when it came through West Monroe. It hadn't downgraded even to a 1. Typically, they're not that strong when they come through here, but
right.
That was a fierce storm for sure.
Right. Well, I know it was. It even hit up here a little bit, and we were like, wow, it's a pretty strong wind to be up here in Arkansas. But what I was wanting to do is give our listeners, Al, just to kind of, I'm sure they all know you, but Al Robertson is the oldest boy of Phil Robertson and the oldest son. And, of course, was in Duck Dynasty for years, the famous show that everybody in the world watched. Matter of fact, I catch myself still watching it once in a while. But I'd like for my listeners,
there's a show that will never end.
Never.
It's like Andy Griffith. It lives into perpetuity, which is awesome.
It is awesome. I love it. I still watch Andy Griffith these days. It comes on 7:00 TV land. Me TV. But you know,
a lot of people compared our two shows because that was the same style. Ours obviously was a reality show, and that was actors, but it has the same elements because you see Andy and Dad, kind of the patriarch and the moral center of the show, and then you've got Aunt B and Miss K, and then you've got Barney and Cy, which are really kind of the reason you love both shows. So I always joke, I was like, I wonder who is Otis the drunk on our show. Is what I always wondered.
Nobody's going to admit to it.
No, that's exactly right. I think the closest would probably be Mountain Man. He might fit into that category.
Well,
not drinking, but just kind of being that guy.
Right. Well, the way that I met you is through my Uncle Mike, of course. Mike is. Do
you remember the first? I remember the first time I met you. I wonder if you remember it.
Well, I don't remember the first time I met you, but I remember the first time that. Go ahead. You tell it.
I'll tell it. So you were a teenager, and you came down to visit Mike, and I don't know how old are you, Jeremy?
Right now I'm 49.
49. Sorry. So I'm 55. And of course, so there wasn't a lot of age difference. I guess I was maybe an intern at the time for the church, or just started working there. Mike was our youth guy. And you came down to visit him, and we played golf at Chenault Golf Course. It was me and you and Mike and somebody else. But that was the first time I met you. And you were a teenager. I think you were still in school. So I was probably just 23 or so. I had just gotten into ministry. But for some reason, I remember that. I can't even remember what I had for dinner yesterday. But for some reason, I remember that.
Well, that's good. Yeah,
I guess you made a big impact.
Well, good. Good. I remember coming down. Of course, wherever my Uncle Mike was, we were close. And I stayed with my grandma and grandpa a lot. Well, every summer, and we would go see Uncle Mike wherever he was, which most of the time was in West Monroe, there at the Whites Ferry Church of Christ. And I remember going down to him, and I have one memories is I remember him taking me out to Phil's house, and looking at it was early. I mean, I was younger than teenager at this time, because I distinctively remember how your dad had all the duck calls lined up on clotheslines out there. And I was like, What is going on? And Mike says, this guy makes duck calls. I was like, no kidding, man. Look at all the duck calls lined up on these clotheslines.
Well, that's funny. I didn't realize that. Yeah, you went back further than me then, because at that time, I was working for Duck Commander, and I was going to college, and I just got married in that area you're describing, and before I went to school and at West Bay Road. But I was the guy that was my job. So I would put 5 calls on my fingers, and I would dip them in polyurethane, and then Dad came up with that system. That's how we dried them. So it was basically bobby pins that were kind of flanged out on the end, and they were on a string, which is funny. You saw that because I describe it to people, and it's hard for them to imagine, but you actually saw it, and they were strung through the trees on the property. And that was my job. I was the one that did that.
I'll be dang. I do. I remember that. And then, of course, over the years, I've come down and visit him and meet you guys. And I remember one time he actually would bring. One time he brought Willie and some of the other, he was the youth minister, and he brought some of the other kids up there. And I remember him bringing Willie to Pocahontas to my grandma and grandpa's. Did you make that trip?
I made that trek myself. Mike and I were going to St. Louis to catch a ball game. and we stopped there and spent the night with your grandparents. And I'll never forget it. I think I've done it maybe twice when we went to baseball games, or one time went to the NCAA tournament that was in St. Louis that year. So that was kind of the halfway point, I guess, the halfway point from here to there.
I'll never forget, I had a buddy, me and Tim Ennis were real close in high school, and we had probably 15, 16 or something. We had, of course, we'd already committed to Christ and been saved and baptized, but I remember Willie coming up and some friends, a couple of friends with him, and I remember him and Mike, and I think they were on a bus. Maybe they were going to a show in Jonesboro, a cappella or something. And anyway, I remember we went with them, and I remember Willie preaching the gospel to us on the way back in that bus seat.
Yeah.
And to this day, so I told my buddy Tim after Duck Dynasty got started, I said, Tim, you remember that guy preaching the gospel to us on the way back from Jonesboro that night? He said, yeah. I said, that was Willie. I said, from Duck Dynasty. He said, you're kidding me. I said, nope, it was.
He didn't look anything like he does now, did he?
No.
He was always a little pretty boy with his little dimple and his hairdos and whatnot.
Yeah.
You know, he went through all the stuff. It's funny because people look him up online, and see him when he was at the age you saw him, and they were like, this is not even the same guy.
Right.
He just cut his hair recently, which was quite a stir. He kept his beard. He didn't do Jay shaved his for a while, but he did cut his hair. He looks a little more like he used to now.
What's everybody doing since Duck Dynasty's not on TV anymore, Al?
Well, it's been really interesting because the show obviously, built this huge platform for everybody, and so everybody's always had a ministry bent. I mean, you just described it perfectly. I mean, we've always wanted to lead people to Christ and wanted to strengthen, families and those type things. It's just I was the only one. Well, Jace went to school with me, and then Willie went for a year before he went to Harding. So we even have a lot. Everybody in the family had some biblical training too. So post show, everybody's been able to kind of follow their passion of what they kind of want to do. And for Lisa and I, we do a lot of stuff on marriage. We do some pro-life stuff because Lisa had an abortion when she was a teenager before we got together. And so, it gives us an opportunity. So everybody's been writing books and things like that. And Willie and Corey, they do a lot of corporate stuff, but then also they do a lot of stuff on adoption because they've adopted a couple of kids.
Right.
And Jeff actually moved to Texas, and he's working for an organization called All God's Children, and it's a really great group. They work with orphans around the world. Jace is he's doing a podcast with me and Dad called Unashamed, and which is going really, really well. Mm-hmm. We reach a lot of people with that. And then Dad, of course, is ironically, he's the first one that had another show. He's got a show on Blaze TV called In the Woods with Phil. Right. It's a digital show. And so I said, nobody probably didn't like filming and doing the show more than Dad. It's not him. He doesn't like silly stuff. And so it was kind of ironic that I told him, I said, you're the first one to have a show post Duck Dynasty. And he said, yeah, I know. And I never liked it. And I said, I know. That's kind of how the Almighty works.
That's the way it works.
So he does that show. That's right. He does that show. And then, of course, our podcast. So he's probably working the most of anybody. I volunteer preach at Whites Ferry Road with your Uncle Mike. And we started that back in January when our young guy, Trent, left. And we're having a blast. I mean, we're both volunteers because he works for another one of our ministries. And I'm doing my thing with the podcast. So I told him that the good thing about preaching for free is that, if somebody complains, you say, well, you get what you pay for, number one. Yeah. And two is you can't be fired when you don't get a check. So it's like, if you don't like it, that's fine. I can do something else. So he and I are having a blast doing that.
I've been listening to your Unashamed podcast for a while, and I told you the other day that my 20-year-old son listens to it all the time too. And it's amazing how you guys, I want to hear how you came up with it and tell more about it. But I get good stuff out of it because to me, it's common sense Bible study. And of course It's always good to hear it. It's authentic, I think, is what I like about it. I mean, it's authentic, and that's that's kind of the way podcasts are, which are exploding these days. How did y'all come about this Unashamed podcast?
Well, it's really weird, Jeremy, because I guess I didn't even realize when we signed a contract for Dad to do In the Woods with Blaze. In the contract, it also had that we could do a podcast. That we were under contract to do a podcast, but we didn't. We're doing the show. We're not even thinking about a podcast. And so, after a year of doing the show, Blaze, their president, reached out to me and he said, "Hey, we would like to do a podcast with you guys." So we said, "Well, that's great." I mean, I'd never done anything like that before, and so I didn't really even, I had not even listened to a lot of podcasts because this is kind of a new phenomenon to guys my age. I was a talk radio guy, but I just, my kids, that's all they do is podcasts. They're in their 30s, so them and younger, that's how people get their information now. And so they said they wanted to do one. They said, but we want to, we have a big platform with a lot of people. I mean, Mark Levin and Dan Bongino and all these, names that people recognize. And so we kind of feel like we've got the political side covered. We'd like to do something more biblical and spiritual. And I was like, are you kidding? And on the conservative secular platform, they wanted a biblical podcast. And so I was like, well, we can do that. I mean, that's right in our wheelhouse. Mm-hmm. So with my cousin and I started a production company called Restoration Productions. And so we produce Dad's show In the Woods, and then we produced this podcast and some other ones as well. And so it's really interesting. So I was kind of just a producer. I wasn't going to be on it. It was just going to be Dad because it was, it was called, and we came up with the name Unashamed out of Romans 1:16 and 17 because that's Dad's kind of go-to verse, and that's his life, So it started out, it was just going to be Dad solo, and then I thought, well, I don't know, Dad's just going to, he'll just be 40 or 30 minutes of just straight preaching if he does it. So I thought, well, maybe I need to just kind of sit in at first and see how this goes. And so we actually started it with me, Dad. We recorded about 30 episodes, me, Dad, and the guy that works for Dad, Daniel. And so we recorded. We were just kind of banking them. We were waiting to launch, And then all of a sudden, Zach calls in and says, you know what? They want Jace to be on the podcast. And so they had done a separate contract with Jace. And I was like, well, that'd be fine. What are we going to do with these other episodes? And they were like, I don't know. We'll just hold on to them. Maybe they'll be the lost episodes one day. So I guess at some point we'll probably release those because they were interesting. It was way different than we do now. But so we just launched into it, and I kind of was the quarterback. I don't really have a contract to do it, but I produced the show. So I just kind of started out to help it go well. And then now, of course, we've kind of locked into our, deal that we're doing. And first we did one. We were just doing one a week, and then it grew to 2, and then to 3, and then to 4. We were under contract to do 4. So we do 4 a week, and we typically record them in 2 days. We do 2 and then 2. So that's kind of how it came to be. And basically, it's as you described, it's biblical. It's kind of, I call it a Bible study Robertson style, because we're gonna be funny. We're gonna tell some stories. Jace never runs out of stories. And of course, a lot of it is us describing to Dad, things that he has no idea what we're talking about, and that in itself is funny. And so I kind of feel like I'm the Ed McMahon of the podcast. Well, I laugh at funny things.
It almost sounds like you guys have been doing this for years, sitting around the kitchen table or somebody's living room or over at my Uncle Mike's, and then now you just started recording it, and that's what it sounds like. You tell a few stories first, and then all of a sudden you get into the verse. That's
right. You're exactly right. In fact, sometimes, I'll look over at our engineer and I'll just give him a wink, and we're just talking. I mean, Dad doesn't have his ear things on or anything, but we'll start rolling into it. And there have been episodes where we've gone, 15 minutes and Dad doesn't even know we're recording yet. But it's just, but that's the way it is. And I think that's why it's successful, is because it's very organic. And very authentic, and you described it perfectly. I mean, we spend our whole lives sitting around the living room or in a duck blind, around the kitchen table, talking about the Bible, talking about politics, talking about whatever, and we don't shy away from anything. So what's been fun for me, Jeremy, is that, kind of like me being on your podcast, is I've really enjoyed, since we added the 4th podcast, that we started having guests on now. Out of those 4, one of them will typically be with a guest, and so I have thoroughly enjoyed getting to hear from other voices, and we've had some amazing guests. We got some really cool ones coming up. So it's that part of it I really enjoy. We just had a double amputee guy that the bomb technician in Afghanistan, and stepped on an IED about 11 years ago, lost both legs. But he's a Fox News contributor named Joey Jones. And I mean, he was so awesome on the podcast. I mean, I love hearing the stories of these people, so it's been super fun for us.
Well, I don't know, we're amateurs on this podcast. I don't know if you had a chance to listen to any of our podcasts, but we're just getting started. We have a trucking company here, Oakley Trucking, and we've got some great owner operators, which, they have their own trucks and they pull our trailers and it's amazing how this is like the 29th episode, I think, out, and I'm getting feedback every day of people that are listening to it that I wouldn't think would be listening to it, but other than our truck drivers and their families, that's what it's made for, is for those guys to listen to it, and it's amazing how it's getting out there to them. So it's just developed another way for us to communicate with our truck drivers and once a week and what's going on inside Oakley Trucking. And I think they really like that. And we're just getting a little bit better as it goes, but it takes a little bit. We was a little rough in the beginning and we still are, but we're getting out there to them, and it's just a great way to get a message to them. So
I did listen, and you're doing great. And you're right. That's exactly how we were. I feel like looking back on it, I think those early episodes sort of helped us do what you're doing, get through that process of being comfortable and, being able to say what you want to say and do it the right way. And then, we've gotten better as we've gone along. I think we're up to last week was 156 podcasts that we're up to now. And everybody kind of understands their lane and what they're doing, and it makes it really good. And to your audience, Jeremy, I just want to say that, man, I mean, I think the pandemic made me realize for the first time, I guess I never thought about it, but whenever President Trump honored truck drivers at some point this past 6 months, I remember having a big thing, and I just remember him having a bunch of drivers. And it highlighted that truck drivers are the backbone of everything, like our economy, the country, the whole deal. And I was so glad that somebody recognized these folks for who they are. And so I just want to add my, appreciation to most of your audience that, we recognize that and realize that. And so I think, sometimes I think I told you, and you and I talked about this before, truck drivers are like offensive linemen. I mean, they do their job. They're in the trenches. They get no glory. It's, the running back and the quarterback and all the skill positions, but nobody could, win a game without the offensive line. And the only time they get recognized is when they miss a block and somebody does something bad. So I think that's what I think of with truck drivers. It's like you do your job every day, and the only time you really think about it is when you're out on the interstate and you see guys going by. But boy, I tell you what, you get a pandemic and where you got to get supplies to stores, and people are having to do that, you realize how important these guys are. So I just want to add my appreciation and thanks to your listeners.
Well, I appreciate that too, and I know they will too, because they are the backbone of our economy, and they do a fantastic job. And if we didn't have them, you're talking about having a pandemic and stuff shutting down. Now, we'd have a problem if trucks quit running. There's no doubt about it. So, I worry. One of the reasons I wanted to talk to you, if you've got a minute, about this is I think about truck drivers being gone during the week, and a lot of our guys get home every weekend, but there's a set of them that stay out longer than 1 week at a time. A lot of them stay out 2 or 3 weeks. Just depends. But, I know I've listened to some of your YouTube videos and your preaching and how you are on marriage and family. And I didn't know if you had ever dealt with or knew many truck drivers that had family issues, and how, it's got to be hard for these guys to hold a family together, being gone all week, because I've listened to some of your podcasts and talk about how important it is to have that father figure at home, and having the authority, I think, is where it comes from. Because, in my church, we talk about how the authority comes from God to the to the father, the husband, and then to the children. And I mean, have you had any dealings with truck drivers and their families, or it doesn't have to be truck drivers, but people away from their families at a week or two at a time, and how that works? You got any input on that, Al?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. It's any profession that keeps people away. And again, sometimes it's just the nature of it. And certainly in truck driving, you're going to have that. I mean, the job is away, and you can't, if you're going to do that, you couldn't avoid it, unless it was something you could find out to do local. And so I have dealt with folks before in these situations. And one is obviously there's several, opportunities, I think, for the evil one to attack. One is just the absence, and especially when you got kids or you got teenagers, when they get at those critical ages, not having, a dad there in the home on a consistent basis can be an attack. And the other is, of course, I've dealt with a lot of guys that temptation is so heavy. You start talking about pornography and other issues that become a big deal. And so a lot of drivers that I've talked to in the past, just through years of counseling and ministry, all those things are factors. And I think the number one bit of advice I would give to anybody is, that because of your job, that these are the ways the evil one is going to attack. And so you've got to have a plan of action in your mind for how you're going to deal with this, because it's going to come. I mean, there's going to be, because you're away from your wife, because you're away from your children, the evil one is going to take that as an opportunity to attack. And so you've got to have a game plan on what I want to do. You can't just say, well, this is my job, and so when I get home, I'm tired, I've been on the road, and not deal with things. And so I think the apathy that can set into people that, when they don't think about it and have a game plan, especially as believers, it's going to lead to a lot of problems. So you have to use technology, I think, because the evil one uses that obviously for negative things, as I mentioned, whether it's pornography or, all these connections people make now. But you have to use that to your advantage and make those touch points on the road as much as possible with your spouse, with your children. The good thing about, phones and computers is just what we're talking about. Listen to godly things, listen to podcasts, listen to things that build you up and not tear you down. So you got to use that to your advantage. You got to FaceTime your family. You got to talk to your wife on a consistent basis. And you just have to figure out ways to be able to help create atmospheres where the evil one is not having easy in to your mind, to your heart, and then to your family. And, and I know it's going to be difficult. So, and that's the other thing. You just got to be a consistent prayer warrior. Prayers of protection over your wife, over your children, over you, and on what you see and what you do. So it's obviously it's not impossible to be a godly person and have a job away, but it takes a lot of effort, and it's just not as easy. And to when you're home, to be able to invest that time with your wife and with your family is important because, and look, I get it. I mean, for years I was in ministry, full-time ministry, but I had a lot of neglect for my wife and children because I was giving so much more to the church, to the bride of Christ, than I was my own bride. And it led to a lot of problems. In fact, we almost divorced 21 years ago. And so, and I was doing all that inside the kind of bubble of the church. So I had the perfect scenario, supposedly, to have a great family, but I was doing the very things I just described in my own family. And so, I had to make changes. I had to invest time. I had to cut some hobbies back, because my teenage girls needed me. So I think all those efforts you have to make, but if you can't do it without a game plan, you got to think about this and you got to implement it. It's not just going to fall into place because the thief, according to John 10:10, the thief comes to kill and destroy and to steal. And Jesus said, I came to give you an abundant life, but it's going to take an effort to get there.
Well, and that goes for everybody, not just somebody away from home or for a week or two at a time. You got to be prepared. I've got to be prepared. If every day I go home every day at 5:00, and there's challenges, and the devil creeps in every way he possibly can. During the day, during the night. I mean, you really got to have a game plan, like you said, to where you're hearing it, you're seeing it, like you said, listen to podcasts, stuff, just, what you do, what you listen to is what you become. And you just got to keep the, I don't know how to say it, but keep the information coming into you so you put more out of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And, Jesus said, he said, out of the mouth flows what's in the heart. And so you want your heart to be full of good things, and your mind, heart in the Bible is the mind, it's your core, it's who you are. And so if you feed that with bad things, then bad things are going to come out and bad results are going to happen. And so you want to put as much positive in. Obviously you're a part of a church community. So am I. I spent most of my life doing that. And it's bigger than just that, because a lot of people have made it just about that 1 or 2 hours at the church building. But all that is to put good stuff in and to have a good community for which to share you and your family's life. I encourage anybody to have that. But you got to, man, that 168 hours is in a week. You got to have way more than just an hour or two of plugging in good stuff. And so thankfully there's good stuff out there. Our podcast, what you're doing, a lot of other people as well are doing great things. We had a couple of guys on a while back, and it's a couple of African-American guys that both work for churches, and they have a podcast called Just Thinking. And I'm telling you, Jeremy, we had them on our podcast by Skype. And it was so funny because you had three, white rednecks from down here in West Monroe, Louisiana, with two highly, educated, city black guys that love the Lord. The only combination we had is we both have a podcast and we both love Jesus. But it was like these guys are like, could have been, raised here and been with us, and us, them, and them, us. And it was really amazing. And so I'd never even heard of them. And the only reason I discovered them was because we typically are one or two in all the religious podcasts in the country. And these guys were kind of bumping up and jumping us every other week or so. It was when all this stuff was going on, because, they have no fear. They talk about this Black Lives Matter and social justice, but they're just straight Bible and Jesus. And so we got together and we were like, man, these guys are awesome. But again, and their podcast is like 2 or 2.5 hours long. They do one a week, but it's super long. And but I want to mention that to your audience, because to check these guys out, especially when they're on the road a long time, and you can listen. For me, it took me 3 days to listen to it just because I'm so busy. But it's well worth checking out. There's stuff like that that's out there that will encourage you. And even with all this chaos that's going on in the country, you run up on these guys and you're like, you know what? There's some people that see it from a biblical lens and are really making a lot of good points about what we're seeing every day in our country. So there's a lot of good stuff out there.
There's a lot of good stuff happening in our country. It's just unfortunate that we don't get to see it on the news all the time, but there's a lot of good things that's happening out there that, I don't think it's near as diversified as the news makes it seem. I feel like I can talk to anybody. I'm friends with anybody. We have all kinds of truck drivers here working for us, and you don't see any of that that the news talks about. So I think you're right. You got to keep putting good information in there, and that's what you get out. And keep the old devil. He is crafty, and you got to keep him set aside, because he'll get in there in your life real quick and mess you up if you're not careful. So good stuff, Al, man.
That's exactly right.
Good stuff.
Yeah, and it's regional too, Jeremy. You're in Arkansas, we're down here in Louisiana, and we kind of sometimes take for granted that basically our local government, our people, understand what our country was founded on. I got a text last night from a couple of friends of mine. They're from Ireland, but they live in LA, and they're journalists, but they do movies and some other stuff. And, Lisa and I met them somewhere along the way, but, we became friends. So if we're ever out there doing stuff in LA, we always go by and stay with them and see them. So they sent me a text last night. They were like, we don't want to be in LA on election night, because we're just afraid of what's going to happen here, because they're anticipating, Trump winning, which, right. I don't know if he will or not. But they said, could we come and stay with y'all? And it was so funny. I thought, isn't that crazy? We live in a place where they're afraid to be at home on election night. And I said, look, we're heavily armed. We're heavily conservative in this area. So this is the perfect place to come spend election night. So they're going to come in and be with us here. So I was like, but it highlighted in my mind. And when we visit them, it's the same way, like, because they're conservative, obviously, and they'll have their friends over and we're there. But everybody's almost talking in a whisper, because they're afraid to be able to speak their mind. And I thought, man, I just couldn't live here. I'm sorry. I couldn't be in a place where I couldn't be who I am, and so I don't want to be in one of the controlled blue states. I'll tell you that right now.
No, let's keep us down south. We all got some common sense down here.
There you go. Exactly.
Oh man. Well, I tell you, hey, one thing before I let you go, I know you're a busy man, but I'm sure our listeners all want to know what Si is doing.
It's funny. Si was post-show, first probably 2 years after the show ended. I don't know if you remember, but the last episode of Duck Dynasty, we had ZZ Top on. And so it was kind of built around Si's retirement, which, in full honesty, he had been retired a while. Si didn't work the last, the whole time we did the show. He wasn't doing any reads. But he wanted to do a music career. He's always loved to sing. He's not really any good. But he loves to sing. He makes a joyful noise, and anybody that sits within 10 pews of him at church can tell you, he loves to sing, but he really can't carry much of a tune. So I told him, I said, well, Si, you want to be a singer, but, I think Bob Dylan has already taken the no talent space in the industry, and but he loves it. And so he for about 2 years, he was going to Nashville, and he recorded some songs, and he had a band. They were called Si and the Psychotics. And it was his daughter-in-law, and he would wear a straight jacket when he came out on stage. So he was doing quite a bit of that early, but he realized he wasn't going to make any money. He was spending a lot of money. We didn't make any money. And so now he just kind of does some charity stuff with it. But he's learned how to play the guitar. And he's Si. He comes over to my house about every other week when he's not on the road or when I'm not on the road. And we play dominoes. He's real close to my son-in-law. They like to fish together and do stuff together. And so he's over here about every other week. We play dominoes usually on Thursday night. He likes to play poker too. So, but he's it's exactly what you love about him on the show is what we love about him. We get him in a duck blind. And when Joey was here the other day, Joey was a Marine. Of course, I was in the Army. And Si got to telling those crazy Vietnam stories. And I mean, Joey was laughing so hard. I was like, it was just like being on the show, So he has changed the least of any of us.
He hadn't changed a bit, has he? Same way. That's
nope.
Authentic Si. That's what you get, the show and post show. All right. Well, good.
Exactly.
Good stuff, Al. I appreciate you taking time to visit with me and my listeners, and it's really good information to talk to you and you to give our guys and our owner operators good tips and pointers on what to do in life and how to manage their life. And I recommend everybody go listen to the Unashamed podcast. I'm a listener, and it sure helps keep me on a straight and narrow path like I need. And it's good common sense about the Bible too. So appreciate you hanging with us. Everybody, hey, I appreciate everybody listening to this podcast. Please share this with everybody and pass it around to the other owner operators. If they're not listening to it, tell them to tune in, because we're going to, communicate with you a lot more every week through this podcast, and looking forward to more podcasts to come. Appreciate Al. You got anything to add? You done?
I just thank you for having me, and man, I appreciate what you're doing. Your uncle is one of the best men I've ever known, and he's one of my closest friends, and I trust him with anything, with my life, with my family, and so you come from good stock, brother.
I appreciate it, man. He's a blessing to me too. All right, thanks everybody for listening, and we'll talk to you next week. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Oakley Podcast, Trucking, Business, and Family. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to rate or review the show in the podcast platform of your choice and share it with a friend. We love hearing from our audience, so if you've got a question, comment, or just want to say hello, head over to our website, theoakleypodcast.com, and click the Leave a Comment button. We'll get you a response soon and may even share some of the best ones here on the show. We'll be back with a fresh episode very soon. Thanks for listening.